Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Steve Maher, and tonight's program is co-presented by NCW Libraries and the NCW Equity Alliance. Our programs are designed to generate open and honest conversations. We encourage different points of view and ask that everyone, treat the topic, our presenters, and each other with respect and kindness. We will be sharing a link here in a moment that will provide you NCW Libraries Code of Conduct for more information. I'd like to start by sharing a land acknowledgement that was provided to us by NCW Equity Alliance board member Karen Francis McWhite. As we come together from all across North Central Washington, let us acknowledge with humility and compassion that we are on the traditional homelands of the Chelan, Colville, Columbia, Entiat, Methow, Moses, Nispelem, Okanagan, Sanpoil, Yakima, and Wenatchee people, both past and present. May we gratefully honor this land and its original stewards. May we commit to be both better stewards and neighbors on this land that we all now share. And with that, it's my true honor and pleasure to introduce our presenters tonight, Chris Rader and Dr. Jerry Garcia. Chris Rader grew up in Pennsylvania and moved to the Wenatchee Valley in 1974. She's now retired from a long career in communications, and that includes working for newspapers, radio, information services, public relations, and freelance writing. Ever since arriving here, Chris has been fascinated with this place that we call home and has been researching and writing about it for decades. Since 2006, Chris has edited the Wenatchee Valley Museum and Cultural Center's quarterly historical magazine, The Confluence, covering numerous aspects of our greater community's development. She is the author of 2 books, both published by the museum. First one is Wenatchee. It consists of mostly historical photos. And the second book is the one that will be our focus tonight, Place of Plenty, A History of Wenatchee in English and Spanish. Dr. Jerry Garcia was raised in Quincy. His parents spent most of their lives working in agriculture. Jerry is a proud migrant child and is in his first gen everything. After serving 3 years in the US Army, Jerry began his educational journey that eventually ended up him receiving a PhD in Mexican and Chicano history from Washington State University. Prior to joining CMAR Community Health Centers in Seattle, Jerry held academic appointments with Iowa State University, Michigan State University, and was the director of the Chicano Education Program at Eastern Washington University. Today, Jerry oversees CMAR's medical education program and is also the new CMAR Chicano, and Latino Cultural and History Museum director. He also promotes and advocates for educational opportunities for the Chicano and Latino community through such programs as the Latino Educational Achievement Project, also known as LEAP. Jerry's research focus is Chicano history, labor, Latin American and Mexican history, Asians in the Americas, immigration, empire, masculinity, and race in the Americas. He has authored 5 books and has written more than 15 articles on his research interests. Please visit jerrygarcialives.com for more details and more on his research and general interests. Again, I want to welcome Chris and Jerry to our program tonight. Finally, I'd like to introduce our moderators, Claire Morrison, NCW Libraries Peshastin Branch Librarian, and Bindu Nayak, Confluence Health endocrinologist and co-chair of Confluence Health's Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Council. Thank you, Claire and Bindu, and I will turn it over to you guys now.
Thank you for the introduction, Steve. We're so glad to be here with all of you this evening. We'll be starting tonight's event with presentations from each of our authors, followed by a conversation with Claire and I, and we'll close with an audience Q&A.
All right, well, we'll let Chris Rader take it away with a presentation on her bilingual history book of the Wenatchee Valley, A Land of Plenty, Un Lugar de Abundancia.
Well, thank you, Claire, Bindu, and Steve. It's a joy to be here, and thanks to all of you who have tuned into this webinar and are showing an interest in the history of multiculturalism in the Wenatchee area. So the book that I have written, and I do not pretend to be the great source of all information about this. I don't know it all, but I find it very interesting. And so I wrote this book called Place of Plenty, The History of Wenatchee. Is this coming in backwards? But anyway, Un Lugar de Abundancia, La Historia de Wenatchee in English and Spanish. So this is a book that a friend of mine, and I can go into more detail later if needed, but a friend of mine, Karen Smith, suggested that to me that we write something, that somebody write a history of Wenatchee that could be available in Spanish for our friends who have moved here from Mexico or Honduras or El Salvador or wherever. And they might have lived in Wenatchee for 20 years, and this is now their home, but they may not be quite as comfortable with English as Spanish. So I wrote this book in English, and then we had it translated into Spanish, so that if you open the book and you read it, and there's a bunch of photographs from the museum, and the Wenatchee Valley Museum holds the copyright to this book. I don't get any proceeds from sales, but on the left-hand pages, the text is in Spanish, and on the right hand, it's in English, so that you can just read the left-hand pages if you're more comfortable in Spanish, read the right-hand pages for English, or if you're trying to learn the two languages, you can go back and forth between the two. Work on the new language till you get stuck, and then go across the page. And of course, it's not line by line exactly equal. But the idea of the book also, not only to share the history and how do you choose what you're going to write about, it was also to share aspects of our history that don't appear in some of the existing history books, and to write this in kind of a conversational style. There aren't a bunch of long sentences. I think it's appropriate for 8th, 9th grade reading level. And I tried to make it interesting, tried to bring in as many kind of human aspects to living here. It's not a bunch of battles and dates like some of us learned about when we were learning history in school. I found history kind of boring because you always had to learn about these charters and these acts that were passed and these dates of battles. And, I'd rather learn how the people lived. So the book has 4 main topic groups: people, agriculture, transportation, and recreation. And it brings us up to the modern day. So the people in chronological order, starting of course with the Native Americans, the Wenatchee Pisclosa people, then the Asians, the Chinese miners that lived here, and so on. And they didn't all get treated so great. The early explorers, and then the early settlers in the Wenatchee Valley, the town developers, then Latinos who came, started coming in the 40s, and with the Bracero movement, and I'll talk a little more about that later, World War II. And then, with agriculture, of course, tree fruit industry and wheat, and Latinos have been a great contribution to that, both areas, of course. agriculture, tree fruit industry, big opportunities now for Latinos. Transportation, I talk about the steamboats and the railroad, various roads that, the highways, and airplanes, including the Miss Vidal, which is a popular subject. A lot of us love the story of Miss Vidal in Clyde Pangborn and Hugh Herndon landing in Wenatchee, the first trans-Pacific flight in the world, landing here in Wenatchee. Then recreation, I talk about sports and parks and festivals and the arts. And this includes some current Latino leaders and the Latino contributions to our modern community. So Claire and Laura are going to share a brief slideshow that I've created. I've just got 12 photographs that kind of encapsulate what the book is about. Then I'll do a short reading from Place of Plenty, maybe 5 minutes or less. And then Jerry, of course, is going to be reading from his 2 books mostly about the Latino contributions to North Central Washington history. So I was going to read from my first chapter, which is the Native Americans. So there's the title of the book. And as I mentioned, it talks about people. You can move along. I'm not going to spend much time. Starting with the Native Americans. And of course, salmon was the basis of their diet, and fishing on the Wenatchee River. This is up above Leavenworth, Tumwater Canyon. And you can see a little fish trap that this guy has stuck so that the fish can't get through those little rocks, and then he gaffs them with his stick. And my book, and the ones you're going to see right now, are almost all courtesy of the Wenatchee Valley Museum. I got permission for a few other ones. But okay, so more about the Native Americans. This family here, Wenatchee Piscosa family, you can see behind them salmon drying on a rack. Of course, they would fillet the salmon, spread them out, dry them for winter use, for year-round use. And that teepee behind them was made of canvas. Before the canvas came into use, they made their temporary dwellings out of tule reeds, mats of tule reeds, which are down in the lower, especially down around Wenatchee. It's kind of like a rush. It's a plant that you dig up and you weave and make these mats. And that was before the canvas. So anyway, okay, what else do we have here? Next slide, please. Yeah, these 2 ladies, and this of course is in the 1900s. There weren't any cameras to capture the thousands of years that Wenatchee Piscosa people have lived here. But on the left, this lady is showing how scraping the hair off of a hide, and deer hides especially, were so important to the local people. And the lady on the right is holding these. This is an example of tule reeds, tules, that would be woven into these mats and then used for, on the base of the teepee and also on the sides of the dwellings. Chief Moses there on the left was perhaps the best known of the Native Americans who lived around here, specifically in the Wenatchee and across the river, Chelan and Douglas County area. He was a member of the Columbia Syncuse band. They were Salish speakers, just like the Wenatchee Piscosa, very close. And the Wenatchee Piscosa came to regard him as their chief also. There were several Wenatchee chiefs. But anyway, the Syncuse, the Columbia Syncuse people were up in Moses Coulee, named after him, on the Douglas County side, and down to Rock Island. And you can see those wonderful petroglyphs, pictographs and petroglyphs on Rock Island were done over centuries. And these were an important part of expressing an art and expressing, there were some of these, the Caucasian people don't presume to interpret what these petroglyphs mean, but they sure look like bighorn sheep or mountain goats or something. And sometimes it seems to indicate a story of a hunt or something like that. But Rock Island, and I write about this in the book, I'm not going to go into it in detail today, but Rock Island got inundated when the Rock Island Dam was put in. And so all these hundreds of petroglyphs were covered, but people managed to salvage some of them. And we have about a dozen rocks with petroglyphs on them at the Wenatchee Valley Museum and elsewhere. So anyway, besides the Native Americans, you can move along. I talk about Asians, and this is a wonderful painting by Walter Graham that really shows, I mean, we don't have any photographs of the mining for gold. This is down on the Columbia River. What do you call it? I can't think of the word. Sluice boxes, and settling out the gold, and they were all up and down the Columbia. At one point, there were more Chinese people living here than in the 1800s, more than whites, and they were all up and down from Stemilt and Rock Island and Chelan and so forth. So anyway, I write about that in the book, and I also talk a little bit about the discrimination against Asian people that occurred in Wenatchee, and the anti-Chinese Act that was a national law for a while, just shameful. And Wenatchee had its anti-Chinese laws, which is really terrible. So we don't have time to talk about all that right now. But moving along, some of the other topics in the book, I talk about some of the early guys that moved here and settled. On the right, that Mike Horan was a famous apple grower, and that's his new Buick 1910. And the first policeman in Wenatchee to actually wear uniforms, the center guy was the police chief, Ed Ferguson, and he's kind of an interesting character. He was also an actor, and he started the Wenatchee Theater, and I talk a little about him. And, that section of my book is maybe the longest chapter, is these early developers, but there's so many of them that are kind of interesting. And you can read about them in Spanish or English. But anyway, hopefully people reading this book, whether it's school kids, I was hoping that schools would pick up the book and, have their students read it during Washington. You have to read about Washington history every year. What is it, the 9th grade? And learn about Wenatchee history. So anyhow, okay, moving along, I'm not going to even talk about the transportation, but Latinos. Now these guys, we think these might have been braceros from the 1940s who came in to help in the orchards while a lot of the Caucasian men and the American citizens were off fighting in World War II, but the orchards, you don't let the orchards die. And this apparently is a walnut orchard, and they're holding these long sticks that they would use to bang the walnuts out of the upper branches of the trees. So I talk about Latinos in chapter 6. It's all about Latinos, including bringing up to speed with modern people, which I'll show in the next slide, and also the orchards, and also when we get to some of the other chapters. Okay, I think these are some of the people in the late 1900s and early 2000s and living today. Lucy Montoya on the left, a lovely young small person, older small person who was very active in the Catholic Church here and very active welcoming migrants to Wenatchee. The Sandovals above there were early Wenatcheeites who, started early Latinos who became leaders in Wenatchee. Below them, Norma Gallegos and her husband, Gustavo Montoya, she has the hand-in-hand immigration services, helping people learn English, learn citizenship so they can pass the test to become citizens. And Gustavo is the former editor of El Mundo, of statewide newspaper in Spanish. And then on the right, Alma and Jorge Chacon, they have the cafe, the family education, El Centro de Familia Educación, I'm not quite sure, CAFE. And they do so much with helping people, offering even free tutoring, helping people, Latinos especially, assimilate and get rent assistance and so forth. And I do talk about some of the other groups active today in the Latino community. All right, and then just kind of wrapping up the last, how many is that? One or two more slides. This is the cover. This is the picture on the cover of the book, and it's a couple of Latino. There's a guy hidden down in the behind the boxes, but the Latinos, so our wonderful community who are so important in our tree fruit industry. And I thought that was a cool photograph from the Wenatchee Valley Museum, and you can take it down now. And so my son, who's a graphic artist, used that as the cover of the book. He colored it. Oh yeah, and then of course, when we talk about parks, I forgot chapter 14, the various parks in Wenatchee and how they came to be. Teresa and the Parque Padrinas and the Kiwanis Methow Park. That's a wonderful story of the Latino community coming together, needing a park in South Wenatchee, right where everybody lives. So I love that picture of Teresa Cepeda. And then the last section of the book is on arts and festivals. And this is some young dancers at Fiestas Mexicanas a few years ago, and also a colorful, unfortunately, the photos in the book are all black and white, but those are some colorful. That's the last one, isn't it? And do I still have time? How am I doing on time? Shall I read a little bit from the book, or might we out of time? Okay, again, here we go. This is what the picture looks like, and here's my son's greening of that photograph. So because Jerry is going to read more about Latinos, I thought I would read about the Wenatchee Piscuosa, and they call themselves Piscuosa. The Sahaptin-speaking Yakimas to the south called them Wenatchee for some reason, and they're the ones that told Lewis and Clark that there was this group up the Columbia, the Wenatchee River. They're the Wenatchee people, so that's why our town is named that. But so I just call them the Wenatchee Piscuosa. And they were a semi-nomadic people. They had a couple of permanent winter, permanent year-round and winter villages, the biggest one being at the confluence of the Wenatchee and Columbia River. But so as the seasons changed, the Wenatchee Piscuosa moved around during much of the year, fishing, hunting, and gathering plants in different locations up the Wenatchee River. Throughout the Wenatchee Valley, from north of Lake Wenatchee to the Columbia River, the people relied on nature to provide food, clothing, and shelter. Cottonwood trees were hollowed out for dugout canoes. The buds and sap of the cottonwood were heated with water to make a glue or cement. Pacific yew and maple branches were used to make bows for hunting. The people cut tule reeds and wove them into mats. The mats would be placed on a log framework to make a teepee. These cozy homes could be taken apart and dragged behind a horse when the family moved to a new seasonal location. The harvest season started in the spring. The Wenatchee Piscuosa had a saying, "When the snow melts, the dinner table is set." Using long sticks, the women would dig up edible roots. To cook the roots, they would dig a large hole, line it with leaves, load it with roots, and then cover everything lightly with leaves and sand. Then they would build a fire on the sand to cook the roots below. The Wenatchee Piscuosa and other indigenous people of the Columbia Plateau dug the roots of blue camas, arrowleaf balsam, swamp lily, wild carrot, wild onion, biscuit root, Indian potato or wapato, and bitter root. Many of these roots were dried and stored so they could be later soaked and eaten throughout the winter months. The people also harvested leaves from many other plants, such as tender young nettles, to eat in the spring or to use as medicine. Salmon was the basis of the diet of virtually all Pacific Northwest tribes. In May, when spring Chinook salmon began swimming up the Wenatchee River to prepare to spawn, which means lay and fertilize their eggs, the Wenatchee Piscuosa moved up to a spot near today's Leavenworth. This location, where the Icicle River flows into the Wenatchee, became known as the Wenatchee fishery. It was such a wonderful place to fish for salmon that many people from other tribes and bands would come each spring too. Each year, 2,000 to 3,000 people from around the region would gather at the Wenatchee fishery for several weeks. It was a joyful time. The men would catch the salmon using gaffs, or poles with sharpened hooks, nets, or traps built from tree branches. The women would clean the fish, cut them into slabs, and then dry them on racks near a smoky fire to preserve them. Chinook salmon averaged 50 pounds and grew to more than 3 feet long. After a day of fishing and fish drying, the people would eat together. Roots and plants would also be part of the feast. Then, in a friendly way, the various bands would compete. They played stick games, raced horses, tossed balls, and challenged each other to balancing contests. Men often gambled on the outcome of these games. Children played too. Games were good ways for them to learn skills. These large spring gatherings were also a time for trade and for weddings and other celebrations.
Thank you for that fascinating presentation. And now Dr. Jerry Garcia will discuss his work on the Chicano Latino experience in North Central Washington.
Let me share my screen here. Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. North Central Washington Libraries and the North Central Washington Equity Alliance. Very nice to see you folks reach out and wanted to hear about the Chicano Latino experience in North Central Washington. So I want to thank Claire, Bindu, who also reached out, Steve and Laura, who all been helping put this program together. So if we were face to face, I'd say give it up for these great people. And so you can still do that if you got access to your emojis. But I want to thank them for all their help. And so my presentation it's gonna be quick. And I also want to thank Chris for your overview of your book. Thank you very much. I'll have to get a copy of that next time I'm in Wenatchee at the museum. So great presentation. And so I'm going to begin with my presentation, kind of giving a quick overview on some demographics, starting at the national level and then working our way down to the Wenatchee area. Let me see if I can get my slides moving here. I gotta move this video bar out of the way. There we go. So this is obviously a map of the United States representing the Latino population, the Chicano Latino population. And I'll use two terms, Chicano, Latino. Chicano referencing people who are of Mexican ancestry, and Latino is a larger umbrella term that includes, essentially all the Spanish-speaking countries that exist. And so, but when I'm speaking specifically about Mexican origin people, I'll use the term Chicano. And then when I'm talking about the broader population, I'll use the term Latino. So here then, this is essentially the Latino population. The map's a little bit, I think it might be about 5 or 6 years old, but it's still very close to what we have today. Obviously, the larger circles represent the larger Chicano Latino communities in the United States, with California having the largest population in the country, and LA County alone has almost as many Latinos as we got people in the state of Washington. There are 5 million Latinos living just in LA County, and there are 7 million people living in Washington. So it gives you a sense of the size of the Latino population just in California. But of all the states, Washington ranks number 13 in regards to the total number of Latinos in the country. We're at over 1 million Latinos in the state of Washington. Let's see, okay. And this here is a representation of the concentration of Latinos in our state. And of course, the darker the color, the higher percentage and concentration. And it's not by accident that North Central Washington and South Central Washington and Central Washington is where we have the concentration of our Chicano Latino population. It's primarily due because of occupations. And this is the, one of our, well, it is the largest agriculture zone in the state. And so the origins of our Chicano Latino community in the state of Washington is the result of agriculture, right? Now, over time, a lot of Chicanos and Latinos have cycled out of agriculture, Dr. Jerry Garcia being one of those people. But because of the high need of a labor force in agriculture, there continues to be a movement of Latinos to the state of Washington to work in agriculture, and oftentimes they will settle out permanently, right? And so I'm sure everybody who's watching today recognizes that, Chelan, Douglas, Grant County, Adams County, Franklin County, Benton County, Yakima County have a large concentration of Latinos, and mostly, not all, but mostly work in agriculture or agriculture-related industries. And here, just to kind of give you some a timeline. As you can see, back in the 1980s, when I was growing up, I was in 1980, I think I was a junior in high school. You can see the population was relatively small. As we move forward in time to the very present, Latinos in the state of Washington mirror what has happened at the national level. At the national level, there are 65 million plus Latinos in the country, the largest underrepresented minority in the country. And Washington is a mirror image of that. And so when we look at the state of Washington, Latinos, over 1 million in population, Latinos are the largest underrepresented group in the state of Washington. So it's a reflection of the national trends, and Washington State's a reflection of that. And then I bring it closer to home. I look at some demographics, so you just kind of see what's happening in the local communities. I did bring up some other groups, but they disappeared in my graphs. And so I'm primarily showing just the Latino population, or Hispanic and whites in these communities. And so Wenatchee, 72.7% in regards to the white population, with 33.9 of Hispanic origin. East Wenatchee, 67.4 white population, and 32.2 the Hispanic population. Quincy is the outlier here. Quincy is 19.5% white and 80% Latino. And let me give you a little comparison here, because this is my hometown, so I know the demographics of my hometown to the beginning of time, as they say. And so I'm going to give you a demographic when I was growing up, when I was like a kid, like in 5th grade, 6th grade, in the 1970s. In the 1970s, the Chicano Latino population in Quincy was only 12%, just 12%. So the populations have shifted over the last 40 years in my hometown of Quincy, where now it's just the polar opposite of what it used to be. And of course, there's a lot of rationalizations for it. And maybe we can get into that a little bit in the Q&A. And I just threw Kashmir in there because it's part of the valley. 67% white and 20.1% Latino. So that kind of gives you a sense of the Latino population from the national to the state and to the local level, right? And as I mentioned, the origin story of Latinos is due to agriculture here in the state of Washington. Right. And I'll make a quick plug, and if I get a chance, I'll show a little clip. And so one of the reasons why I left academia in 2018 was to come to Seattle and curate and oversee the first Chicano Latino museum in the Pacific Northwest. And I think might have been somebody that mentioned it. I think it was one of the moderators. Our museum is located in South Seattle. We opened in 2009, and we were only open for 4 months before the pandemic forced us to close. And so I always tell people, at this moment right now, we have been closed longer than we have been open. But that is changing because we reopened our museum in August of 2021, just a few months ago. But our museum showcases the history and the culture and the contributions that Chicanos, Latinos have made to the state of Washington. And our museum tells our origin story to the state of Washington, which is tied to agriculture. And so in our museum, if you ever get a chance to visit, in a little while, I'll give you the address, you will see the devotion that we pay to agricultural workers, because most of us, right, a lot of us are just one generation removed from the agricultural fields. In fact, as was mentioned in my introduction, my bio, I'm half a generation removed from the agriculture fields. My boss, the CEO, president of my organization, is also a migrant child, but a generation before me who grew up in Othello, Washington. Right? So many of us then have living memories of working in agriculture and agriculture fields. And that's definitely not only my experience, but one of my motivations to tell this story as often as I can in these kind of presentations or in my writings and in my books. Right? And so again, the map I showed you earlier in regards to the population, this map's very similar to that in regards to the concentration of where our agriculture is located and the crops that are produced in those areas, right? that need essentially an army of workers nearly year round. Right? And then the other thing I like to really kind of teach to people during these kind of presentations to make sure people walk away with the understanding that there have been essentially about 3 different waves of the movement of Latinos to the state of Washington. Right. And the first one actually begins in the 1920s, 1930s, and they're going to the Yakima Valley. So the Yakima Valley is kind of like ground zero for the beginning of our community in the state of Washington. And in fact, many families that would end up in Quincy and later Wenatchee would originate from the Yakima Valley. And then when water opened up the Columbia Basin in that region in Wenatchee, then they began to move out of places like Granger, Toppenish, Wapato, Yakima, and into the Columbia Basin, looking for opportunities in agriculture. So we got this wave in the 1920s, 1930s. Then Chris mentioned the Bracero program, which was a 24-year program that ran during World War II, but also post-World War II until 1964. But the images that I have in my books and the image that I think that Chris showed are from the World War II time period, the 1940s. But we don't count that as immigration because the Bracero program, which was actually a bilateral agreement between the United States and Mexico, was not immigration. It was a treaty signed to bring in temporary workers for 6 months to a year, and then they would return back to Mexico. And that's how it worked, for years and decades, is that a lot of these workers would come in, and the highest concentration were in 2 areas: California, the largest; Texas, the second largest; and then the Pacific Northwest had the 3rd highest concentration of braceros. Right, and so because it's temporary work, right, through a treaty, we don't count it as immigration. Now there is kind of a side note on this. Because it ran for so long, 24 years, and there hasn't been a really kind of a exhaustive study on this, but there's no doubt, right, between 1942 when the program started and when it ended in 1964, nearly 5 million braceros were brought into the United States to do that labor. And out of those 5 million, we know that a good number, again, there hasn't been a strong study on this, but we know a good number broke those contracts and stayed in the United States. And when they broke their contracts, they became undocumented immigrants, right? However, back during the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was very easy to get your residency card, what is popularly known as a green card. Very, very different now, obviously, but back in this time period, all they needed was an employer to sponsor them and they would get their green card. And that's what many did, right? And so that if we look at it from that perspective, it becomes kind of like an unofficial form of undocumented immigration into the United States. And then, of course, when the Bracero program ends in 1964, that essentially is the beginning a large number of undocumented immigrants coming into the United States because there is no longer a control of labor that the Bracero program played, right? So there's a mechanism in place that triggers undocumented immigration, and that mechanism is the Bracero program becoming obsolete. And so the workers knew where to go, and there was no official channel to come here. So then they just did it on their own, becoming undocumented. And that's a whole different story unto itself, but just want to give you an idea about that. And then in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, what this map represents is what we call the Tejano diaspora, right? The movement of Mexican Americans known as Tejanos from Texas, as you can see, going throughout the country, right? And the first major permanent settlers in our home state of Washington were Tejanos, Mexican Americans coming from the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. And so when we did interviews of hundreds of people from this era, they were from Texas, with a handful coming from California, and you would find some from Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Montana, but their origins was Texas. And then they would migrate up to the Rocky Mountain region, eventually to the north, and eventually to Washington, right? So there's this process, this migratory routes that the Tejano diaspora followed, and they would be following the crops, and they would go back and forth between Texas and Washington year after year after year. And what changed was the development of agriculture, the increasing development of agriculture, the opening up of acreage, and the development of water because of the Grand Coulee Dam. So when that all happens and it coalesces, what you have is a permanent agricultural labor force that is needed in the state of Washington. So many families then stop migrating back and forth between Texas and Washington and make Washington their home state. And that's exactly what my family did. My grandparents followed these migration routes out of Texas, and they would go to Arizona, Colorado, Montana, picking the various crops, and to Washington, and they would travel back and forth. Eventually, my grandfather made a decision to settle permanently first in the Yakima Valley, and then eventually he moved his family, which included my father. At that time, my father and my mother had already met and married, and they ended up moving to Quincy back in the late 1950s. And I was born in the 1960s in Quincy, Washington. So the Tejano diaspora then is very, very important to understanding the movement of Mexican Americans throughout the country. As you can see, the arrows pointing to everywhere, and a lot of these states have a very similar story. In fact, one of the stories I remember very fondly is Wisconsin, because Wisconsin's population of Latinos has a very similar origin story to the state of Washington. The movement out of Texas, the migration, the settling out in Wisconsin because of agriculture, and so we can find the same story. What they have in common is that they're coming out of Texas. And then we really don't have a diversity of Latinos in the state of Washington until the late 70s, early 1980s. And that's a reflection of U.S. foreign policy in Central America, the civil wars that are being caused because of disruption, and U.S. foreign policy playing a big role in that. And then, of course, with the civil wars, what you got is displacement and people being uprooted. And then, of course, when that happens, they're gonna move to a place where they can find some stability, and that happens to be the United States. So then, in the 70s and 80s, what had been primarily a Mexican American situation now becomes a little bit more diverse, right? Now you got people coming from Central America, and particularly Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And so, but you should know, in the contemporary period, the Latino population in Washington State is still 80% Mexican origin. So it's still overwhelmingly Mexican. But if we're talking about the 1950s, 1960s, then we're talking 90+% of the population is Mexican origin. But it changed a little bit because of foreign policy and the movement of immigrants out of their home country from Central America to Washington State, to many places besides Washington, but Washington being one of those areas. And so here then, those are my grandparents in the top picture up there. And that's their immigration picture as they crossed the border, with my father at the very bottom there of that picture, and my uncle Roberto at the very top. And so this is very classic. I use my family because this story here about my family that I just shared with you is replicated over and over and over in regards to the history of people of Mexican origin here in the state of Washington. And so I just use my family as an example because I know that story very intimately. And as I tell their story, I'm telling the story of tens of thousands of other Mexican Americans that came from South Texas. And then the picture at the bottom is another kind of important family in the state of Washington, the Martinez family, two brothers that really kind of stood out from this family. This is a picture when they were young kids in Minnesota at a labor camp. And they would migrate from Texas to Minnesota, eventually to Washington, right? But these two brothers I'm talking about, one is named Samuel Martinez. He became an important figure in the Chicano movement here in the state of Washington in the 1960s and 1970s. And his brother Andy was an important political player in the state of Washington during the same time period, right? So here we got migrant children, right, that are growing up and their formative years are during the civil rights movement, the 1960s and 1970s, and they're being politicized. And they use that education. They go to college, use their education to try to improve their communities. And so this is the Martinez family. I really only got to know the two brothers, Andy and Samuel, who have both passed away in the last 10 years or so. And in this book, if you can see it, I feature a story about Andres Martinez because of the role he played politically at the state level and national level. And so I got a little story in there about him. And this is the Bracero program. Just wanted to show you a couple of pictures. But if you look at the state of Washington map, there's another map that I have, but I couldn't find it. But both maps essentially show the Bracero program camps, the POW camps, and the camps where they held POWs that would work in agriculture from World War II. Right? And so this is the Bracero program, labor during World War II, played a huge role in the state of Washington. Here's the other map. I actually have it here. So this is a much clearer map. And so you can see Wenatchee actually had a Bracero camp here. And in fact, this is one of my research areas. And I didn't include it, but one of the things that I researched, and I'm about to publish a book on this, are the deaths of Braceros during World War II. And so when I say World War II, I'm really only talking about 3 years of the Bracero program, from 1943 to 1945, right? And remember, the Bracero program lasted to 1964. But in the 3 years that I study, I have uncovered 320 deaths of Braceros throughout the country, not just Washington, but throughout the country. But I found one that here in Wenatchee. In fact, he's buried in the Wenatchee Cemetery. And what the caretaker told me was the pauper section. And I went there and I found his grave, his name, and I took a picture of it. And that picture will come out in my book when it gets published in probably about a year or so. And so anyway, the Bracero program is important for the state of Washington. It's important at the national level, and it just happens to be a strong interest of mine as far as research. And this is a picture from Wenatchee, Braceros going home at the Wenatchee Depot. Right? And this image on the right is just the trajectory of the large numbers of Braceros that were used. So you can see 42 through the World War II period. It's not very much. In fact, only about 400,000 came during the World War II period. But where it really shoots up is post-World War II, all the way to the mid-1960s. As you can see, millions are coming in. Right? And again, I could do a whole presentation just on the Bracero program, but we don't have time for that. And so, but I do want to show you, the labor. These are non-Braceros. These are Mexican American women who work in the Yakima Valley and the hops, right? So these are the Chicana Latina, Rosie the Riveter types that you think of in mainstream U.S. history. These are the Latina women, Chicanas, who are doing the labor because the males have left for World War II. I also wanted to show, it's important, when we look at the Chicano Latino population, regardless of where you are, whether you're in the state of Washington, Nebraska, Alabama, Georgia, that we look at this population beyond the lens of agriculture, right? Because when we look at the Chicano Latino population, whether it's Wenatchee, Kashmir, East Wenatchee, Quincy, Othello, Moses Lake, there were more than just agriculture workers. And some of these pictures attest to that. So this one on the left is an elementary school picture from the 1960s in Quincy, Washington. So education has always been an important subject for the Mexican American families. Right? Now, the reason why a lot of Mexican Americans did not graduate is a totally different story, right? It has everything to do with social economic status in the United States, which forced many Mexican American children to leave school to help support the family. Right? And that continues to some degree even to this day. And so on the right side here are people from the Quincy area who are trying to better themselves through adult education at Big Bend Community College in the 1960s. Right? So again, this idea of education, because one of the stereotypes, especially when you read research studies on the Mexican American population in the United States in the 30s, 40s, 50s, even into the 60s, one of the things that you'll say is that the Mexican family is not interested in education. But that, of course, we know that was flawed research, and nothing could be further than the truth, even back in this time period, even to the contemporary period. So education was always very, very important and remains so. And then, of course, I also wanted to showcase this a little bit. The movement from agricultural laborers to owners, right? So this is kind of, this came out in my book in 2007. So I hope they're still in business. I haven't kept up with them, but Jose Limon and Max Campos were able to use their skills as laborers to eventually own their own farms, their own orchards, right? And that's in my book progression and important in regards to the Chicano Latino experience and contributions to the state of Washington. And also, this is also from my 2007 book. Now many Chicano Latinos, as I mentioned, I know this individual Martinez from Quincy. His family was just like my family, agricultural workers. He was able to graduate high school, get his education, get his teaching credentials, and is now he might be in administration now, because this is back in the early 2000s when he was a teacher in Quincy. And then here we got one of the first principals in the Wenatchee area back in the early 2000s. And so here we got a great progression in regards to many Chicano Latinos cycling out of poverty and agriculture and into the professional arenas. So very, very important. And then this last slide is the museum that I oversee in Seattle. And so this is a fantastic museum. There's the address. So if you're ever in the Seattle area, we are open, and we're the only museum that I know of so far. I've gone to a lot of museums in the state of Washington that is, especially in the Seattle area, that is free. We don't charge anything for visitors to come in. And so I really encourage you, if you ever get the chance to come to our museum, to take a look and explore the museum. It's a fantastic place. We opened up in 2019, shut down in 2020, March, and then we reopened again in 2021 in August. Okay. So that's kind of the end of my, what I call my formal presentation using my PowerPoint. And maybe one of the moderators can tell me if I still have time to read a couple paragraphs from one of my books.
Yeah, I think that's fine. We'll go ahead and maybe cut the conversation piece a little short, and right after you finish the reading, we might just move directly into the audience Q&A.
Okay, so I'm actually going to read from another book that came out in 2017 called We Are Aztlan. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Chicano history, Aztlan is an important word in our history. Aztlan is the homeland of the Mexica, and the Mexica are the ones that created the Aztec Empire, right? And so it's important to the Chicano experience because the actual homeland, the actual location of Aztlan has never been located, primarily because the Spaniards destroyed all the literature of the Aztecs when they invaded and conquered. All we know is that it was somewhere north of present-day Mexico City. So the Mexica then, the ones that founded the Aztec Empire, created their capital, what became known as Tenochtitlan. And Tenochtitlan today is what we call Mexico City, right? So it was the Mexica that created that. And the Mexica came from somewhere north of Mexico City. And one of those locations is potentially what we call in the United States, the Four Corners regions of the United States. Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. So it's possible that the Mexica came from that region, but there's also a couple other areas in Mexico that they potentially came from. Nevertheless, this word Aztlan becomes very, very important to Chicanos during the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 1970s, because it provided them with a sense of a homeland, right? That they're not foreigners in the United States, that they've always been here as indigenous people. And in fact, they could be in their rightful place all along if the Aztecs are determined to have come from what is today the Four Corners region of the United States. So we are Aztlan. And so, my job for the last nearly 20 years has been to put Washington State on the map in regards to Chicano history, because we got a tremendous amount of that here in the state. And so I'm gonna read you the last chapter of this book called "Becoming Aztlan in the Northern Borderlands." And overall, it's about my experience growing up in Quincy during a time period when Chicanos were a very small part of that population, and the primary population were whites. Okay, so I start off this song with the first sentence in Spanish. So I'll read in Spanish and then I'll translate it. So I wish I could sing. I'd sing it to you. It's actually the first line of one of my favorite songs. So it goes like this: Salieron de San Isidro, procedentes de Tijuana, trajeron las llantas del carro repletas de hierba mala, eran Emilio Varela y Camila Tejana. The translation goes: they left San Isidro from Tijuana. They had the tires of their car filled with bad weed, marijuana. That's the bad weed. They were Emilio Varela and Camila, the Texas woman. So this is the first line from a very famous song, Contrabando de Traición, sung by Los Tigres del Norte. And if you're a Mexican worth your salt, you know who the Tigres del Norte are. That's why I always tell people. So Los Tigres del Norte, one of the most beloved bands for people of Mexican origin in the United States. Composed in the early 1970s, Contrabando de Traición explored the taboo topic of illicit drug trafficking. It became one of the first narco corridos, a subgenre of the corrido music industry. So again, I got to stop for a second here. So a corrido is a musical genre that originates in kind of northern Mexico, and it has a lot of German influence to it, especially with the accordion. But the word corrido comes from the word correr, and the word correr is translated in English to run, right? And so what the corrido is, and this is why it's one of my favorite genres, it's a running history of an event. So a corrido then has very particular elements to it. And usually it's about an event, about an individual, about the Mexican Revolution, about the Chicano movement in the United States, about a tragedy that occurred in the community, about a catastrophe that may have happened. So what people will do in order to remember this, they will create what they call a corrido, a song, right? That replays the event through music. Right? And so it's, as I mentioned, this song that I just read the first line of is from that genre, a corrido. So as teenagers, this was my cousin Mundo's anthem and mine as we set out on the weekends to raise whatever hell we could in a community of 3,000 people located in North Central Washington. I remember cruising in Mundo's black Trans Am with Los Tigres blaring from his speakers and doing our best to emulate our father's gritos or shouts. Our gritos were often followed by this line: living easy, loving free, season ticket on a one-way ride, asking nothing, leave me be, I'm on a highway to hell. Highway to Hell by heavy metal rock gods, AC/DC, was our secondary mainstream anthem as we try to stay cool and current with our white peers in Quincy, Washington. Mundo and I felt a strong connection to Contrabando de Traición, not because we were involved in drugs. We were like 12 years old when we first started hearing this song. We would have been the youngest, maybe the youngest drug traffickers, I don't know. But that wasn't the reason, that's not what was happening. But rather, for how the corrido spoke to us regarding the ideas of freedom, rebellion, and identity. The corrido was also very popular within the Mexican community because it spoke of betrayal, something the Mexican community experienced on numerous occasions from mainstream society. More important, Los Tigres del Norte, like many of their fans, were immigrants, migrants, who crossed the border and made it to America would never shed their most precious commodity, their Mexicanidad, or their Mexicanness. On another level, I believe the popularity of Contrabando y Traición can be explained by the fact that it reminds many ethnic Mexicans that they too, regardless of status, are treated as contraband as they move from state to state or from Mexico to the United States. When this song emerged in the early 1970s, the movement of marijuana to the United States was commonplace. This smuggling speaks to the idea of borders and the dangers of navigating such terrain with cargo of contraband. The same comparison can be made with the smuggling of human beings along the same pipelines as illicit drugs. The confrontation between La Migra, immigration authorities, loose translation, or law enforcement with both smugglers and immigrants, migrants, Chicanos, resonates with the lived experience of many Mexicans. Danger lurked on multiple fronts for Mexicans entering the United States. And simply being Mexican was laden with peril. As a result, Contrabando y Traición is imbued with many elements of the Mexican lived experience, both real and metaphorical. Ultimately, the images of freedom, borders, treachery, betrayal, and rebellion are why Mundo and I gravitated so strongly to this groundbreaking song. My adolescent experience allowed me to explore the various borders, cultures, and contradictions I had to navigate in an attempt to maintain my Mexicanness or Mexican identity in a location with few Mexicans. At the same time, I struggled against assimilation forces that often subsume part of my identity. So this chapter provides a personal insight on autoethnographic examination of a Chicano existence in the Pacific Northwest, a borderland experience different from that of Mexicans in the Southwest. I submit that living and growing up in the Pacific Northwest provided unique experiences that varied from those along or within the traditional US-Mexican borderlands. Gloria Azadua, a very famous poet, author, feminist, wrote, "Borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them." Azadua spoke from her experience as a queer Chicana from the US-Mexico borderlands, yet her experience resonate with all borderlands people. We as Chicanos in the Pacific Northwest slipped in and out of various cultural identities as a coping mechanism for survival. This experience also illustrates multidimensional spaces occupied by Chicanos in the northern borderlands and the various corridors of our lived experience. The northern borderlands of the Pacific Northwest also provided many contrasts. For example, the dichotomies of modernity and traditionalism, Mexican culture, US culture, US-Canadian border, US-Mexican border, came to represent my lived experience. We lived in multiple worlds, sliding in and out of what seemed parallel universes, never forgetting our origins and the culture of our family, but also embracing mainstream ethos as teenagers. This is the world we created for ourselves, the one I remember, and went out of the Northwest, the one I long for. So that's the introduction to this chapter. And that concludes my short reading. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to move directly to audience Q&A. So audience members can put into a question into the Q&A, and we will get to as many questions as we can.
And if you're looking for the Q&A feature, it's just on the bottom of your screen, just a couple or over from the chat button.
Okay, I think we can start with one question for Chris. Chris, I'm hoping you might discuss briefly the railroads and government's historic false promises regarding the Wenatchee Piscosas, their longstanding legal battles for restored fishing and hunting rights, and where things stand today.
That's a big question, and it's a fascinating one. In 1855, the U.S. government sent Isaac Stevens down to Walla Walla to call together a tribal council of all the tribes and bands in the Northwest, and set up a treaty by which basically the U.S. was going to bump them out of their lands and send them to reservations. The Wenatchee Piscosa were assigned to the Yakima reservation, but they were supposedly given the Wenatchee fishery that I mentioned up there by, the Icicle and Wenatchee area, the Wenatchee River confluence. They were given that as a treaty right, and that was again confirmed in the 1890s. But nobody from the U.S. government ever set up the boundaries. They kind of surveyed it. They didn't mark it. They didn't say anything. Meanwhile, all these Caucasian settlers moved in, started moving up to Leavenworth and the area, and this happened all over the West, of course. And by the 1890s, by 1900, the Wenatchees had the rights to this land, but it wasn't really being honored. And so here, 120 years later, there's a group in the Wenatchee, as I mentioned, were assigned to the Yakima Reservation. They didn't feel at home there. It's a different language group and different geography that they were used to. Most of them did not go. A lot of them went to the Colville Reservation, or some had allotments that they stuck with down here in Wenatchee and Methow and so on. And they, meanwhile, some people say it was stolen. The US government stole the land. Well, they did in a way. And in a way, it was just out of carelessness. They didn't properly mark it off. And so white people didn't know any better in a way. It hadn't been said, hey, this 6 mile square is native land. You can't put up a homestead here. So anyway, now at the Colville Res, which is 12 confederated tribes, there is the Wenatchee Advisory Group, and they are working to have those treaty rights restored. And I wish them the best, and I hope it's going to happen. I'm not the great expert on this, but I really hope that they can get the US to honor those two treaties.
All right, thank you, Chris. And it looks like we've got another question for Jerry. So this question says, Jerry, what can we as a community do to support Hispanic, Latino, or Latina adult education, increase student post-secondary attainment, and improve early learning and K through 12 education? 3 or 4 recommendations for each would be appreciated. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. I'll try to give you something. Well, there's no doubt. I mean, one of the things that outreach is probably one of the most important tools that we can use. I do that literally almost every day out of my office in Seattle. I work with a lot of Latino youth throughout the state, and making sure that they get opportunities. And oftentimes it's just awareness, right? Education about those opportunities. And so I know in the Wenatchee area, I know there's a camp program, a college assistant migrant program, but what's missing is a HEP program, which is a high school equivalency program. And it's funded by the same agency, the Department of Education. And that HEP program would allow the opportunity for a lot of people of Mexican ancestry who didn't have the opportunity earlier in their lives to get a high school education, and they can get a high school equivalency degree, which is very similar to a GED. There's just a fine line between those two, but essentially with that high school equivalency program, they can transition into an institution of higher education, get a better job, or opportunities above and beyond community college and four-year university. So definitely opening up those opportunities, getting the word out in regards to what's available. In Wenatchee, they have Wenatchee Valley College, which has served hundreds, if not thousands of students of all backgrounds. I know a lot of Latino students go there today, and they end up transitioning over to the University of Washington or Central or Heritage or Western. And the reason why I know this and that they're from Wenatchee is because my organization offers a scholarship to Latino students, and I often get scholarship applications that are coming out of Wenatchee, and they mention the camp program. They mention working in agriculture with their families. So this the outreach that we do in regards to just that is we saturate all the social media, And that's why we end up getting applications for our scholarships from throughout the state. Right? And so let me give you an example of something else we're doing that I'm probably going to end up making a visit to Wenatchee somewhere in the very near future, because one of the things, I work for a healthcare provider. In fact, we're the largest community healthcare provider in the country, known as CMAR Community Health Centers. And I'm going to give you an example of where our Latino community is kind of hurting. Right? So in the state of Washington, there are 32,000 physicians in the state of Washington. At least there were 2 years ago. Right? And this is from a University of Washington study. 32,000. And out of those 32,000, 3% are Latinos. Just 3%. Now, what is the percentage of Latinos in the state of Washington? 13.5%. So you can see there's a massive disparity, right? And inequity in regards to the number of physicians in the state and those that are of Latino origin, right? And so part of that study, at the pace we're at now, it would take over 500 years for Latinos to reach parity with whites in the state of Washington. Over 500 years. So we can't wait that long. So what we're doing is creating a pipeline, right? A pathway for students starting in the middle school, right? In the middle school, introducing them to the importance of not only healthcare, the STEM fields, and then getting their minds thinking about the healthcare fields. And then we ratchet that up in high school, and then we make sure they graduate, and then they go to college, whatever college they want, right? And that they are focusing on the health sciences. And then we get them into medical school, hopefully University of Washington, and then we get them into our residency program. So the great thing about CMAR is that we will eventually have 3 different residency programs. We have one at Marysville, Washington. We have one in Seattle, and we're about to open a new one in Vancouver, right? So we got the locations for Latino students or doctors, because you don't go to residency until you finish medical school, right? So we got the locations. We just got to get Latinos and Latinas into the pathway in order to become doctors, go to medical school, and then transition into our residency program. And then once they're board certified, our hope is that they'll work with our organization and serve our community, but they're free to go wherever they want. But the point I'm trying to make is that we call that the physician workforce pipeline, where there's a massive disparity of underrepresented minorities. And so when we look at that percentage, that's what we want in all areas, right? So if we are 13.5% of the population in the state of Washington, then we should be at least 13.5% in regards to political representation at the state level, at the local level, in Wenatchee, right? There should be at least 13.5%, or whatever the percent. Well, the percentage of Wenatchee is what, 30%. So Wenatchee should have the political voice, right? The representation in Wenatchee, city council or what have you, should be at least 30% Latinos, right? So it should mirror the population of that community. Okay, so there's a lot of areas there that we need to work on as far as Latino population. Now we have made great strides, right? Great strides since I was a child, back in Quincy in the 1970s and 1980s. We've come a long way since that time period, but we still got a long ways to go. And here I'm just talking about the inequities in regards to opportunities, but there's also so many other areas. And one of the things that we can't, that I definitely want to mention before the program ended was, right, the treatment, right? How Latinos are treated in the Columbia Basin, in the Wenatchee Valley. I have no doubt that things are better than they were 20 years ago, but we still got a ways to go in regards to making sure that everybody's treated equally and fairly, and that we move away from any forms of racism. And of course, that's the only way that's going to happen is the community working together on that. And that's why I was, very happy to join today's panel, because I think, this discussion, right, although it's only one discussion, it's, one step forward to that reality that we're talking about. And, that's why I was so happy to get the email. I think it was from Dr. Bindu. Sorry about that. I'm corrupting your name. And so I apologize, but
No,
yeah,
we're so happy that you accepted.
yeah. So, because I would love to live back in my hometown, but they would have to have a university to give me a job there, so I could work. So I don't. I had no real excuse, to be quite honest, for not going back to North Central Washington, other than just trying to fulfill my own personal dreams, right? But I know, since I was able to cycle out of poverty, I was able to cycle out of agriculture, that I know that I could do. I would be a good role model for other Latino children, right? And show them that it can be done. If I could do it, right? Then I have no doubt that anybody can do it. And I mean that literally, because I was I was not a very good student, but not because I was smart or not intelligent. I think my education credentials prove that, but I didn't have the support, right? I didn't have really good support when I was in the K-12 system in the Quincy area, or else I wouldn't have joined the military. I would have gone straight to college, right? But again, there's a silver lining in everything, right? And one little piece I'll tell you, I didn't share this.
Jerry,
Yes.
Jerry, I think there's some other questions that people want to ask because we're running out of time.
Okay.
I
I have a
see-
question for both of you, actually. In your book, Chris, you talk about the history of racism towards Asians in the early 20th century in Wenatchee. That was quite remarkable and disturbing, especially since the Asian population has never really increased above 1% since then. Do you think that the level of racism encountered by Asians in those years was greater here than in other parts of Western United States during that time period? And was there ever an acknowledgement of the history of that racism that took place in Wenatchee by public officials? And question for both of you.
I don't know that there ever was a real apology, but racism against Asians was pretty widespread in the early 1900s, in the late 1890s and 1900s. And, people, I think the whole subject of racism, we could spend another hour and a half on that, and attitudes. People learn their attitudes, a lot of them from their parents or from their teachers. And this fear of the other, fear of unfamiliar looking people, kind of settles in when you're a kid. And unless you address it, I heard on NPR yesterday, or I forget, I guess it was on PBS on TV, they were talking about the Holocaust, and they had this Jewish woman or survivor of the Holocaust, and they asked her, how can we ensure that this kind of racist, because Jews were considered by the Nazis to be an inferior race, how can we ensure this doesn't happen again? And she said, and I totally agree, we gotta keep it up. We have to educate. We have to tell children about it. We have to keep this current in the culture. We can't just let it die away. A lot of people, kids, I don't know how much my grandkids know about the Holocaust or about how terribly we treated Asians, in Wenatchee back then, and how people are afraid of or unfamiliar with, so they kind of ignore or stay away from people of other races. We've got to bring it up. And that's one reason that I wrote this book, to bring up some of this stuff and to educate, so we know about it and we can talk about it and think about it.
Thank you, Chris. I think, we're getting close to time here, but I have one closing question for you all. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what kind of work you'd like to see done in the area of North Central Washington history moving forward, and what kinds of stories you think need to be told.
Well, I guess more of the same, more and more people kind of delving into the little bit that I've uncovered, and of the various ethnic groups that we've had here. I don't know it all, and learning more about that, and then teaching tolerance and acceptance and modeling tolerance and acceptance, using the past as a way of kind of engaging children or people, anyone learning history, in analyzing that and say, that wasn't so great. That wasn't so great. And, you know, Jerry's talking about Latinos are not being represented in these fields like they ought to be. Just bringing it out, facing it, discussing it, and, you know, having people just realize it, talk about it, and try to do better.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, I would agree. I mean, there's so much history that has not been told about so many different groups, right? In North Central Washington, Wenatchee Valley, right? And you know, what I have done, I think what Chris has done is just the tip of the iceberg. Right? And so much more can be written. But I also think, you know, history got to be written truthfully, right? With the good and the bad. You know, can't be afraid to look ourselves and say we made mistakes, right? And you know, the question before was about you know, Wenatchee officials apologizing to Asian Americans for the treatment. Well, just today, San Francisco issued an official apology to the Chinese community for their horrible treatment. In fact, so when we say horrible treatment, that's not even touching the reality of the situation. They were massacred. You know, Chinese were massacred because they were a threat to whites economically, right? And so they were massacred,
thrown into internment camps.
Yeah. So it's pretty ugly, and this is what makes it difficult for a lot of people to hear this kind of history, because it turns the history that they thought they knew on its head, right? And it shows a part of U.S. history that a lot of people don't want to know about or believe happened. But when you talk to people of color, that's their history, and they want it to be told.
It's so disturbing to read about these school districts in Texas and wherever that want to block any reading of anything that's going to make anyone uncomfortable about racism. You know, we've got to face it. We've got to bring it up and talk about it and let people know this was not okay, and we're not going to do it anymore.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the just get back to the original question, Claire. I think there'd be a really good study to do something on the religiosity of Latinos in this region, because you know there was a time that we could say 90% of all Latinos were Catholics. You can't say that anymore, right? A lot of Latinos have joined different denominations in the last 25 to 30 years that is not Catholic, other denominations. So I have no doubt, you know, just you know, my some of my family still live in Wenatchee, and I go visit. I see a lot of different churches that Latinos go to that are not Catholic. So there's been some great studies nationally, but I have no doubt a nice kind of historical overview on why Latinos have left the Catholic Church to go into these other denominations in the Wenatchee area, Quincy, Moses Lake, right? The Baptist denomination, the Mormon Church, just a lot of different ones. And so that's a fascinating topic from my personal perspective.
Great.
I
Well,
think we have
thank you.
time for one more. Or
Okay.
I was going to say
Go
one more
ahead.
question. One quick question was in the books, is there more detail about why the Bracero program was not renovated?
Okay, renewed?
Must be renewed was a,
Yeah. Very simple. 2 reasons. One, there was a tremendous amount of backlash from the unions, because Braceros, you know, so the Bracero program, that's why it's been very difficult to revive it, because a lot of people remember the treatment of Braceros. It was pretty bad, right? Even here in the state of Washington, they weren't treated overwhelmingly very well. There's a lot of good stories about that should be told. And actually, in my book, The Illusion of Borders, I tell one of those stories. But it ended because Bracero workers were being used as strike breakers. And so the unions mobilized against that and lobbied Congress that Braceros are being used to come in and replace the workers that have gone on strike for better wages. All right, so that's one of the main reasons. The other one has to do with the United Farm Workers of America. I hope we all know about Cesar Chavez, right? Cesar Chavez, one of the great civil rights leaders, labor leaders of the 20th century. He lobbied Congress because the growers in California were using braceros to try to break his boycott and strike against the growers to get better wages. So you had these unions lobbying Congress to end it, and under that kind of pressure, Congress failed to renew it in 1964 and just let it die. Right? But like I said, that had major consequences on the U.S. So
That is fascinating.
yeah, so it's and there's a lot of literature on the Bracero program. You know, it's probably one area that's been written the most about the Mexican experience in the United States is the Bracero program. Literally hundreds of books, thousands of articles. And so it's out there. All you got to do is just Google Bracero program, and you'll get thousands of hits.
Well, great. Yeah. Thank you so much for both of your answers. And I think we're just about at time. So I'll hand it back off to Steve, who will be closing our program off for the night.
Yeah, thank you again, Jerry and Chris. So appreciate your time this evening and your fascinating insight into the history of communities of color here. I thought I knew a lot, but I learned a lot more tonight. And also thank you to all of our attendees. We had a really good attendance for this event, and we thank you for being here for the last hour and a half. For the latest news and information about NCW libraries, you can visit their website, follow them on Facebook, and also sign up for their e-newsletter. And I believe we're going to be putting that in chat if we haven't already. Also, you can join NCW libraries tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. for the second program in its salmon recovery speaker series. And then you can also check out their event calendar for more information on that program. Also, if you want to reach out to the NCW Equity Alliance and want some information on them, you can email them at ncwequity@gmail.com. Again, that's ncwequity@gmail.com. And with that, I want to thank you all again and have a great rest of your evening.